Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
So today we're going to dig into a discussion that's been doing the rounds online. It's all about Lewis Hamilton, obviously, and his first season with Ferrari.
Yeah, it's definitely stirred things up. Lots of takes, lots of opinions flying around about how he's doing, his relationship with the team, all that stuff.
Exactly. And what we want to do today is really unpack the key arguments from, well, one particular analysis we saw online and the reports it references. Try and get past the headlines, you know?
See what the actual points are, because
Right.
this piece raises some pretty interesting ideas, especially about his current form compared to Leclerc, and also some comments he's reportedly made recently.
Right. And the starting point, the basic premise laid out in this source, is pretty direct, isn't it? They basically say Hamilton is not having his best season.
Not just not his best, but that he's, well, clearly losing the battle against his teammate right now.
Okay. And the source feels this doesn't give a good sign. Is that the gist?
That's the feeling, yeah. It sets a bit of a concerning tone right from the start.
So a tough assessment. How does this discussion back that up? Does it put this season into context with his past performance?
It does. They actually suggest this year kind of follows on from last year, which they described as, wait for it, his worst season as a Formula One driver.
It's his worst season last year. Wow, okay. That's a huge statement for someone like Hamilton. What reasons did the source give for calling 2023 his worst?
Well, they pointed to two main things.
Mm-hmm.
First, his final championship standing. He finished 7th.
Seventh, okay.
And they make the point that that's actually lower than his previous career low, which
Yeah.
was 6th place back in 2022.
Yeah,
So statistically, a step down.
got it. So final position is one metric. What was the other big reason they cited? You mentioned two.
The second one, and maybe more pointed, was the qualifying head-to-head against George Russell.
Ah, yes.
They framed it as a pretty significant beating. I think the final count was 19-5 against Hamilton across the season.
19-5.
Yeah,
It's quite a margin.
exactly. And the source emphasized that for a driver who's seen as, one of the absolute greatest qualifiers ever, losing that Saturday battle so clearly was, well, pretty telling in their view, a major factor in calling it his worst year.
Okay, so that sets the scene from last year. How does this analysis then connect that to what's happening this season, specifically against Charles Leclerc at Ferrari?
Well, the narrative continues, basically. The comparison this year is presented as leaning heavily towards Leclerc so far.
Right. What do the numbers look like according to this source?
So in qualifying, after the first 9 races, the score they mentioned is 7-2 in Leclerc's favor.
7-2. Okay.
They do mention Hamilton was ahead in China and Spain, but crucially, they add a bit of context for Spain.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
Apparently, Leclerc might have compromised his qualifying run slightly because he was focusing more on the race setup, saving tires, that kind of thing, which, could explain some of the gap on Saturday there.
Interesting detail. And it wasn't just the win-loss tally in quali, was it? The source also highlighted some pretty big time gaps in certain sessions.
Absolutely. That was a key point. They pointed out some pretty noticeable deficits, nearly 0.6 of a second in Bahrain qualifying, half a second in Saudi Arabia.
Wow. Half a second between teammates is...
Yeah, it's substantial, right?
Yeah.
And they also mentioned Leclerc just generally being faster, having the upper hand in places like Monaco and Barcelona qualifying too. It wasn't just isolated incidents.
Okay, so that's the Saturday picture. What about the bigger picture, the championship standings? How does that comparison look?
Leclerc's got a 23-point lead over Hamilton.
23 points already.
Yeah, and the point the source makes is that after just 9 races, basically a third of the season gone, that's almost a full race win difference.
Even factoring in Leclerc's disqualification in China, right?
Exactly. Even with that, the gap is significant and building relatively early.
Okay. And what about actual race performance? Did they touch on that beyond the points?
Yeah, briefly. They mentioned the Barcelona race specifically, where Hamilton apparently fell back quite a bit during the race
Yeah.
and was even overtaken by Hülkenberg at one point.
Hülkenberg, really?
Yeah. The source found that moment quite difficult to understand for a driver of Hamilton's caliber, suggesting something wasn't quite clicking in race trim either.
Right. Okay, so the performance data paints one picture. But this online discussion also delves into Hamilton's sort of demeanor and some specific comments he's apparently made. They use the word spicy, I think you said.
Yeah, that's where it gets interesting. They observed him sometimes seeming a bit apathetic or downcast, even suggesting he might be in an almost self-destructive mode at times.
Self-destructive, that's strong.
It is. They described his paddock presence as sometimes having a face of very few friends. You give really short monosyllabic answers to questions, just generally looking quite frustrated.
Okay, you can sort of picture that sometimes.
Yeah.
Were there specific quotes attributed to him that really stood out in this analysis?
Yeah, couple. Early on, back in Bahrain, there was a quote where he apparently said he felt he was failing Ferrari.
Failing Ferrari. Wow. That's quite self-critical.
Very.
Yeah.
And then, according to this source, he went even further after the Barcelona race.
What did he supposedly say then?
Something along the lines of, I'm sure the team won't find answers. It's probably me. Probably me.
Probably me. Oof.
Yeah, the source called that comment very tough.
No.
Really highlighting a potential lack of confidence, maybe.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, now this leads into the part of the online discussion that seemed particularly animated the reports from Sky Italia. The source found these very surprising and, again, spicy. This was about Hamilton giving Ferrari homework.
Exactly, yeah, that's the framing. The quote they referenced from those reports was Hamilton saying something like, in Maranello we have a fantastic simulator, but since I arrived, I've suggested pages and pages of things I think should be improved. We're working on it. We are continuously working to improve.
Pages and pages of suggestions. So he's being very proactive with feedback based on his experience.
Seems so. And, to be fair, the analysis did acknowledge another reported comment where he apparently praised Ferrari's wind-tunnel correlation, saying it was good, maybe even better than teams he'd been with before.
Okay, so some positive feedback too.
Right. But the overall interpretation of this online piece was still that, despite that positive note, the pages and pages comment and others were like important jabs at the team's current processes or tools.
Okay. And then there was another comment attributed to him that really seemed to provoke a reaction in this analysis, the one about focusing on next year.
Yes, that's the one. The quote reported was, soon I will tell the team it's time to focus on next year. This season is about building a base, learning the tools both in structure and processes, and perfecting them so that in 2026 we have the car we really want.
Soon I will tell the team it's time to focus on next year. Okay, I can see why that might raise eyebrows. Why did this specific statement get such a strong reaction in the discussion?
Well, this is where the source really pushed back hard. Their argument was, basically, that it's fundamentally not the driver's job, even a driver with Hamilton's status and experience, to dictate to a massive F1 team, hundreds, maybe 1,000 people.
When they should switch development focus.
Exactly. It's just not seen as the driver's call to make.
Whose call is it then, according to this view?
They were very clear. The decision lies squarely with the team principal, Fred Vasseur, in consultation with his technical heads. It's based on deep engineering assessments, data about the current car's development ceiling, diminishing returns on investment, all that technical stuff.
Not just a feeling from the cockpit.
Not at all. You only make that huge strategic shift when the technical team says, okay, we've pretty much maxed out what we can get from this year's car.
And the analysis pointed out there are layers of management at Ferrari, right? Even above Vasseur.
Yeah, they mentioned the big fish, higher-ups, who would almost certainly weigh in on such a massive decision about resource allocation for next year versus this year.
So the takeaway was that while Hamilton's feedback is valuable,
Absolutely. Pages and pages from a multiple champion is gold dust.
telling the team when to switch focus is maybe crossing a line, especially given his current performance relative to Leclerc.
That was precisely the argument. It was seen as overstepping, particularly when he's, quite clearly behind his teammate on track right now.
Which brings us neatly to the next major theme in this analysis. Why Hamilton, according to them, might not actually be in the strongest position right now to be making these kinds of demand or directives.
Yeah, they laid out several reasons for that. The first, and probably most obvious one, is just pure performance.
The gap to Leclerc we've been talking about.
Exactly. He's consistently not matching his teammates' pace this season based on the data they presented. That's point one.
And did they connect this to his age at all?
They did, yeah.
Yeah.
The suggestion was that, realistically, given where he is in his career, it's going to be inherently difficult for him to suddenly reverse that trend and find, several tenths consistently against a younger teammate like Leclerc.
What about off-track factors, like the commercial side?
They touched on that too. The argument put forward was that while his signing was this massive marketing boom for Ferrari, initially huge excitement, merch sales through the roof.
Right, the hype is immense.
That initial peak excitement has maybe arguably started to plateau a bit now that the reality of the season is setting in. The sort of novelty factor might be wearing off slightly.
Okay, so performance, age, Potentially a slight cooling of the initial marketing frenzy. What was the other really big point they made relating specifically to Ferrari's own history and, like, team culture?
Ah, yeah, this was hammered home pretty strongly. The piece basically stated, very forcefully, that no driver is above Ferrari, ever,
The team comes first.
always. They pointed to Ferrari's history, even using Alain Prost as a specific example from the past, of being, well, pretty ruthless. They're not afraid to kick you out, as the source put it, or show a driver the door if they feel that driver's crossing a line, criticizing the team too much, or gets too cocky.
Implying that even a name like Lewis Hamilton wouldn't be exempt from that if things went sour.
That was very much the implication, that the institution of Ferrari is paramount, and no individual, no matter how successful, can afford to forget that.
That historical context definitely adds another layer. Did they mention any other sort of smaller things adding to this picture?
Just briefly, yeah. They noted some radio outbursts from Hamilton during races this year, moments of clear frustration. And they also suggested, maybe more subtly, that he doesn't seem to have the absolute best relationship with his race engineer this season.
Little things that might indicate underlying tension.
Potentially. All these elements combined, according to this analysis, create an environment that's maybe already a little bit hot, as they described it.
Okay, so looking forward, how does this online piece see things potentially playing out? Is there a time frame they highlighted as being particularly crucial?
Yeah, the focus really shifts to next year, 2026. That scene is absolutely key.
Because of the huge regulation change, right? The new cars, new engines.
Exactly. It's a massive reset. The piece mentioned the reports that Hamilton signed a 2-year deal with an option for a 3rd year.
A 2+1 deal.
Right. And they see 2026, with those totally new cars, as the real test bed. It's a clean slate, technically speaking.
And they laid out two main possible scenarios depending on how that year goes.
Pretty much.
Right.
Scenario 1. If Hamilton really clicks with the 2026 car and regulations, adapts better than Leclerc, and starts consistently outperforming him.
Then all this current stuff might just fade away.
Basically, yeah. The current performance gap, the awkward comments, the perceived friction, it could all be forgotten relatively quickly if he's back on top form in the new era.
Okay, makes sense. And scenario 2, the alternative. What if the current pattern continues into 2026?
Well, if he continues to be, clearly outperformed by Leclerc for what would then be a 3rd consecutive year this season, next season, and then 2026.
That's a long time to be second best in the garage.
It is. And the piece suggests that in that scenario, Ferrari might genuinely have a difficult decision to make regarding that 3rd-year option in his contract.
And if the performance doesn't improve, and he keeps making comments like the ones discussed, the prediction is the atmosphere could really deteriorate.
Yeah, they used words like the environment becoming quite sour, or even the possibility of a proper falling out developing between Hamilton and the team, if the results aren't there and the public statements continue to cause friction.
Now, this was a really interesting angle in the analysis. They suggested that if this relationship does start to sour, we, the viewers, might actually see signs of it quite publicly.
Right. Because Ferrari, they argued, can sometimes be quite transparent, or maybe predictable, in how their internal team dynamics leak out or become visible.
How so? What kind of signs did they suggest we could look out for?
Well, they gave specific examples. Things like maybe hearing more desperate or frustrated radio calls from Hamilton during races.
Okay.
Or noticing clear signs that Ferrari's strategy calls are overtly prioritizing Leclerc over Hamilton.
Like giving Leclerc the preferred pit stop timing, maybe?
Potentially, yeah. Or another example they gave was team orders, maybe seeing Hamilton being told to let Leclerc pass more readily or frequently, then we might see the reverse happening.
And they even brought up past examples, didn't they? Like how Ferrari managed Leclerc and Sainz sometimes.
Yeah, they referenced the dynamic with Carlos Sainz as a sort of case study, suggesting similar patterns of how team management plays out publicly might emerge again if the situation with Hamilton becomes strained.
So these on-track moments, the radio messages, the strategy choices, they're presented as potential clues, visible indicators of the health of the underlying relationship.
Exactly. Signals that might tell you more about what's going on behind the scenes than just the raw finishing order, especially if things are getting tense.
It's definitely a complicated situation, isn't it? Lots of pressure, high stakes. The piece finished by saying they wouldn't want to be in Fred Vasseur's shoes, which kind of sums it up.
Yeah, it really highlights the tightrope he has to walk. Managing 2 top-tier drivers, immense expectations, the unique Ferrari pressure cooker, and doing it all when one of your star signings isn't, at least right now, delivering quite what was hoped for compared to his teammate. It's a massive challenge.
So, just to pull it all together from this online analysis, the core tension seems to be this gap we've discussed. Hamilton's current on-track results versus Leclerc set against these reported comments where he sounds quite assertive about guiding the team's direction.
And all of that is playing out against the backdrop of Ferrari's history, that whole new driver is bigger than the team ethos.
Right. It creates this fascinating dynamic where, according to the source, Hamilton's incredible status and experience might be bumping up against the reality of his current performance, potentially weakening his influence inside the team if this trend continues.
Yeah, that's the crux of their argument, I think.
Okay, so that leaves us and you listening with something interesting to maybe watch out for. Based on this analysis, especially the idea that team dynamics at Ferrari can sometimes spill out onto the track through radio strategy, team orders, and given their history, what specific little signs or interactions might you look for in the next few races? Things that might hint at the real state of the Hamilton-Ferrari relationship, maybe telling a story that goes beyond just where they finish on Sunday.